author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
John Durham, after 4 years of investigation, released his much-anticipated report into the now-debunked Trump-Russian collusion scandal. Who won and who lost in this epic battle of narratives? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special Durham Report edition, we're going to examine the questions the media refuses to acknowledge, the legal aspects and the political. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Brownwood, Texas on KXYL 1240 AM and 102.3 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. What did the release of the Durham Report tell us, and what does this mean for politics and professional integrity of the nation's enforcement agencies? Well, we're joined by a special Liberty Nation Durham panel to find the answers. I'd like to welcome aboard longtime host of this here show and senior political analyst, Tim Donner, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and man about town, Scott DeCosenza Esquire, and chief political correspondent, Graham J. Noble, who's been tracking the investigation since the very beginning. Gents, thanks for being here.
Pleasure.
Now, I know I don't want this to be a round robin format as such, but let's do a round robin first. What do we make of the report? Was it a smoking gun or a nothing burger? Tim, why don't you kick us off?
Well, for me, the most surprising part was that it said exactly what we've all been thinking it was for these many years. A strategy concocted by the Clinton campaign strictly to discredit Donald Trump and scare the American people off him. There was nothing more than that. And yet the leftist media is trying to say that there's nothing, how predictable. There's nothing new here because there were no criminal indictments. It's a nothing burger. But I think it's interesting with looking at the comment section of a prominent Washington newspaper with which all of us are familiar.
I saw that comment section today, Tim. Yeah.
There was a mixture where there's usually it's 20-1 leftists to conservatives commenting. But this time, there were a lot of people that said, look, Trump is horrible. He's a psychotic maniac, whatever. But this is not acceptable. So I think this is going to have some legs, but nothing like it should, because it'll essentially be brushed off by elite media.
Yeah, we will be delving into the media aspect of this. I think that the reaction from the fourth estate at large it's really quite something. It's like a full court concerted press. But Graham, what do you think what did you make of it?
I think, Mark, that it is very, to me, even the most vocal critics of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and even the most zealous Trump supporters on the other side, these people, to me, it cannot be understated how terrible this is. What happened with this Russia collusion hoax, and the way the Federal Bureau of Investigation jumped on it, and Durham's report very clearly, apart from, as Tim alluded to there, there's an entire section of that report that is devoted to how the Clinton campaign fabricated this whole thing to begin with and disseminated it and got it out there. And but the fact that it was investigated at all is, I don't think we can underestimate just how damaging this was to everything that America is supposed to be, to the rule of law and to an abuse of power and trust in our institutions. It's really, I think people really need to wake up and look at this for what it was, which was a kind of a Venezuela-like, banana republic-like, massive abuse of power for the sake of to prevent one man from becoming president and trying to make sure that another, his challenger, who is just about possibly the most unpopular person on the planet, got in instead. It's hard for me to put into words how bad this is, and I think the fact that obviously nobody is going to pay any price for it. There was one FBI attorney who was actually convicted, and the others, I think there were 3 or 4 other indictments. Each of those, I believe, ended with an acquittal, and nobody's going to pay the price for this. And I think the country, quite frankly, is damaged almost beyond repair because of this.
I wonder, Graham, if that's why...
Not to be too overdramatic or anything.
Sure. We'll remove the eyeliner. I wonder if that's really what's behind the comment section in the prominent Washington newspaper that Tim mentioned earlier, is that people have seen what's happened here. And at some level, people who read that or follow that particular news outlet, they already have a bad opinion of Donald Trump and are under the impression that pretty much anything we can do to stop him is justified.
Yeah.
But if it can happen to one side, it can happen to your side. And I think that might be the key to people really a joining of minds across the aisle that this shouldn't have happened in the first place. And if it can happen once, it can happen again. But next time, it could happen to me. And I think that's a worrying.
Well, look, that's an indicator of how serious this matter is. When you have people who absolutely despise Donald Trump, and yet they are saying this was too far. This went too far. This was over the line. Because a lot of people on the left at one time, anything bad that happened to Trump for them was okay. Any crossing the line, any transgression of the law, any abuse, anything at all that would bring down Donald Trump, they would accept, or in theory, they said they would accept. But now some of those very people are saying, well, hold on a minute, this was a little too much. And I think that tells us how bad this really was.
Yeah, and I think Graham was being a bit of a shrinking wallflower in his opinion there on the situation. Scott, what's your take?
Well, I'll take the opposite view of Graham, and I'll look at this in its best light. And I think that considered in its best light, we can say that the principal federal law enforcement agency, the FBI, is completely and totally corrupt and has been since its inception. And unless the people get serious about replacing it in some massive fashion, we're never going to see the end of this. We have a Department of Justice building in D.C. that's called the J. Edgar Hoover Building. They haven't even taken his name. They've taken down the statues of Jefferson and Washington and our founders, who were flawed because they weren't perfect, but they had genius ideas about how to help people be free. And yet J. Edgar Hoover was about his own aggrandizement and violating the civil rights of Americans by the score, and they keep his name on the front of that building. And that tells you, I think, everything you need to know about the corruption there. And again, I think that's a best case scenario. The worst case is, like Graham says,
don't hold back, Scott.
The entire republic is rotten to the core, and like a tree that you think is mighty and grand, but a lightning strike reveals it's completely hollow and barren on the inside. That's the other extreme. And I'm not sure where the needle lands for me, but the question you asked initially was, is this a smoking gun? My God, yes, it is a smoking gun.
Mark, you and I are both students of the John F. Kennedy assassination. And one of the conspiracy theories, which may or may not have been true, was that the CIA had killed Kennedy. Why? Well, after the Bay of Pigs disaster in 1961, when the CIA told the president that they had his back no matter what happened to the invaders of Cuba, and they turned around and abandoned. He said he was going to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and shatter it and spread it to the wind. And I think there's a lot of people that now think that that's exactly what should happen with the FBI, that it needs to be broken up and replaced with another organization that can start from scratch. Of course, we know this isn't going to happen, but we're talking in any kind of business. This kind of activity would result in immediate dismissal and probably prison terms. But here, nobody even, not only did no one really get caught and get sentenced, except the one guy that Graham referred to, who nobody ever heard of, but they have the audacity to come out and say, see, there was nothing to see. It shows you that the left lives in an entirely different world than the right, not just different views or world views, but different worlds.
Hey, let's put it on the Republicans too. They control the power of the purse now. Let's see what they do with it, right? If they don't do some massive correction with their power, then a pox on all their houses. Then they both want it to continue, both parties.
All right, we'll be back speaking about these specific institutions after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's Durham Report panel, Tim Doniscott, Decasenta, and Graham J. Noble. Earlier on, we talked about the overall impact of the Durham Report, but now I'd like to get your thoughts more on the institution. So Donald Trump, he's been complaining for the last 7 years, pretty much, that all hands were set against him. And this is a phrase that he's used time and time again. He said it was a witch hunt. And I've been thinking about that particular phrase, because a witch hunt, witches weren't real. So it was, they would say, well, if they drown, they're not a witch. If they don't drown, they're a witch, so we burn them. And it seems that the witch hunt really was what was happening at the hands of these agencies, wasn't it? Scott, why don't you kick us off?
Well, except that the entirety of the witch hunt seems not designed to, produce political gain and power for the more like a mass hysteria thing, I think. And for this thing, we know it was a hit job. This was Hillary and her leadership team, the people who are at the top of those circles, making a political hit on Donald Trump, aided and abetted by a supplicant press who's still now basking in their awards that they gave themselves.
Pulitzers,
for
Peabody's.
Fake story. And that's again, that's the smoking gun that the report revealed. It was a grand conspiracy. The conspiracy's laid bare, and we know it not because of any reporting from these press people who have on speed dial these administration officials, but because of Russian intelligence and Russians spying on Hillary Clinton and her campaign people. That's how we know this. It's a disgrace all around.
Think if the elite media had the least bit of curiosity or willingness to touch this story, far from being on the other side of promoting what they knew to be false, we pretty much know all along. Think if they had just touched the surface with this, how differently this would have turned out. In other words, the problem with these special prosecutors is they are assigned in the heat of the moment, and then they go on for years with their investigations, and by the time they come out, the other side in any instance can say that's old news, nothing new, nothing to see here. That's the problem.
Let me just pop in here and say, Tim, you're so right. The next presidential election is going to be affected by this conspiracy. You think about it, like we're now going to see reverberations to Donald Trump's ongoing campaign to be the nominee and to be president that are going to be profoundly affected by this revelation. Again, the FBI, once again, with their hands in another election.
I really want to jump in on this, Tim. Sorry.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
we learned that CIA Chief John Brenner, he visited the Obama White House to speak with the top team there,
To
uh,
brief, not
to
to
brief
speak
the
with,
top team.
to deliver
That
a briefing.
that Hillary Clinton, a Hillary Clinton aide, had come up with this idea to disparage Donald Trump by connecting him to Russia. That was the heart of the thing, right?
Mhm.
Now, surely Joe Biden was involved in that briefing, wasn't he? I mean, either he was Barack Obama's wingman
Mark,
or he
a
wasn't.
great question for Joe Biden is, what did he know and when did he know it? I think it's
Exactly.
inappropriate to say that we know what he did know, but it's a great question for him, and that he isn't asked that by everyone all the time, and they let Karine Jean-Pierre get away with saying she's
Just
not going to
walk out of the
comment.
briefing as she
That
did
is an
on
indictment
Tuesday.
of our colleagues in the journalism.
Gentlemen, she cannot comment on an ongoing investigation.
It's
a,
not ongoing
couldn't
anymore.
expect her to
It's
do
It's a
finished.
Hatch Act. It's a Hatch Act violation.
Oh,
The
that's
Hatch Act.
it.
Graham, what's your
Hatch
take?
Act,
The,
right.
the most horrendously, the most obscene irony in all of this, and it's not irony in a funny way, it's irony in a really bad way, is the fact that Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence officer who, by his own admission, was quote desperate unquote to see that Donald Trump never became president. He was the one that came up with this dossier, which is actually a collection of kind of memos and media, news media clippings and kind of other, salacious
dreams.
In fact, what his primary subsource, the man that provided most of that material to him, described it as gossip and innuendo. And that's bad enough. The fact that the FBI just mobilized an entire investigation to look into gossip and innuendo. But the worst irony is that Trump was being accused of colluding with the Russians, and yet the primary Christopher Steele's primary subsource was a man named Igor Danchenko, a Russian. Okay, he was
He's
living
French,
in Washington.
right? He's French, right?
Yeah, right. But he was living in Washington, D.C. So to me, this is the most ridiculous part of it all, is that we are supposed to believe that, it was so terrible that Trump was colluding with the Russians, which of course he wasn't. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And yet the almost all of the material that was being used to investigate Trump's connections with the Russians came from a Russian national. Yeah. And it's you would have thought that somebody at the FBI at some point would have said, there's something wrong with this picture. We're supposed to be investigating Trump for his connections with the Russians, and our entire investigation is based upon what a Russian has told us.
Graham, if only we had 51 intelligence agency specialists to write a letter. And we're going to be right back with the panel after this short break discussing the media and whether they're giving back their Pulitzers. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation special Durham Report panel. Tim Donner, Scott Cosenza, and Graham J. Noble. Earlier in the show, we've discussed the fallout of the Durham Report. We've discussed the issues with the agencies involved. But now, obviously, we feel that perhaps we're safe in understanding what happened to the Durham Report because we had Pulitzer Prize winning, Peabody Prize winning journalists telling us the story of the Durham Report, of the Russian collusion that never was for the last 4 years. Scott, tell me, are they going to hand back those Pulitzers that they won?
We are flirting with World War III because of this reporting. It is, you run out of ways to call it a disgrace and a violation of all principles of what's supposed to be a profession. And the difference between a profession and a vocation and an avocation is that even if it damages your short-term interests, you're supposed to actually uphold a greater principle. And the press here is so contemptible in their behavior. I just can't even begin to describe it with adjectives that I'm aware of. I have to come up with some new ones. And they're not giving back their prizes because they are shameless and disgusting. And that's the read of the press on this.
New adjectives to go with new pronouns if you want them, Scott. Tim, what's your take?
Well, strangely enough, what comes to mind here is a couple of children's stories. One of them is Pinocchio, and the other one is all about crying wolf. And I think what the press doesn't realize is that they've cried wolf so many times that the effect of these multiple investigations on Trump gets watered down each and every time. Because why? Because their nose keeps growing, just like in Pinocchio, every time they tell a lie. And they think they can protect Joe Biden and his cohorts and Obama and Clinton and everybody. They think they can protect them. But that's why we have elections. And assuming they're free and fair elections, it's hard not to believe that this disgrace, which was at least as bad as the conspiracy theorists on the far right had said it was, is going to have an impact on this election. It's just hard to know what impact, given that people have lost, they've lost all respect for journalism.
Palace guard for the establishment is the one thing that they're good at. That's like they
are the Praetorian Guard of the 21st century.
Graham, the Praetorian Guard or just misguided?
I think. First of all, I mean, I would say when it comes to the media, kind of the what we generally refer to as the establishment media, what a lot of people call the mainstream media, which is kind of an outdated term now because we have the internet and so many other sources of information that the term mainstream media is now obsolete completely. They're not mainstream at all. So, the establishment media, I would almost call them the statist media. I am very torn because, look, if you go back to the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson had a very, very contentious relationship with the media. He did not like them at all. They didn't like him. He once said something to the effect that the most honest thing you can read in a newspaper is the advertisements. And and everyone is loath to say anything bad about the media because a free press, it's the foundation of a free society and all of that kind of stuff. Well, that's all well and good if you have genuinely a free press, but in this country we do not have a free press. The entire establishment media is bought and paid for by corporations and all of it, and I include Fox News in this, all of it is controlled by people who have agendas and have motives for spinning the news in certain ways. And so to me, the very idea that we have a free press is nonsense. The only free press we have is all the alternative online sites, such as Liberty Nation, and
go check it out in your browser,
and various other ones. But the big cable news networks, the big newspapers, they're not the free press at all. It's ridiculous. And as much as I am, as libertarian as I am, libertarian almost sometimes bordering on anarchist, I still sometimes, a little piece of me says, why can we not hold these journalists accountable when they blatantly and knowingly and intentionally lie to the American people, and in doing so they do actually influence policy, they influence election outcomes, they do an enormous amount of damage, and we never hold them accountable because we're like, well, it's free press, you can't start punishing journalists because then you're going down the road towards dictatorship. I'm like, well, actually, we're kind of already halfway down that road.
Lying is free speech too, Graham.
So at some point, Yeah, and I do understand that, Scott. So I'm not actually literally saying that we should start putting journalists in prison, but
Let's hope not.
there has to be a way that that these people are held accountable for their lies, because leaving them to continue doing it is it's unforgivable.
We all hold them accountable with our clicks and our attention and our
subscription dollars.
I would say, unfortunately, that we're not. Unfortunately, an awful lot of Americans believe this stuff that they put out, and I think we're in a very dangerous moment in history right now, because the establishment is telling us that disinformation, what they call disinformation, should be not only countered, but the people who put it out should be punished, even if they are like private citizens. And we're getting to that point. We're getting to the point in Europe and in Canada. We're getting to the point where people are being, just ordinary people are actually being pursued by the authorities for spreading so-called disinformation. And yet journalists, for some reason, are exempt from that kind of for being pursued for the same reason. And I'm not sure that I think that is how it should be. I don't know. I'm not sure I know the answer, but we have this protected class of so-called journalists who are escaping the punishments that everybody else is facing for saying things that other people decide is disinformation. And when they are lying to us and getting away with it, I don't know if I feel that's where we should be going.
Part of the answer to this, we're seeking answers, actually came in recent days when Tucker Carlson announced that his show was going to be going on Twitter. So as Elon Musk expands that portfolio of Twitter and starts to draw in major media talent, maybe from all sides, he'll probably take all comers. But with Tucker Carlson displaying his wares on instead of Fox News, that's a major blow to corporate media in terms of what it portends for the future, where big corporate management can't step in and dictate what will and won't be done. I mean, the Dominion lawsuit proved that the executives didn't know what they were doing at Fox News, and it cost the network $800 million in a settlement. The Twitter sign up by Tucker Carlson, I think, portends very significant good things for the future and the beginning of a long-ringing death knell for elite corporate media.
So free markets are once again the answer. Who would have thunk it?
Yes,
right, gentlemen,
sir.
we'll be back after this short break talking the legal aspect of the Durham Report. Please don't go anywhere. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with the Liberty Nation Durham Report special panel with Graham J. Noble, Scott DeCosenza, and Tim Donner. Now, we've discussed the wherewithal, the media, the impact of this thing, and the impact on the agencies. But now I'd like to dive into the legal section. So we're going to ask Scott DeCosenza, as our resident legal eagle, to do some of the heavy lifting here. Now, I found it quite confusing that pretty much every left-leaning media outlet focused on how few criminal charges were actually made from the report. But was that ever the point?
Wait a minute. You found a left-wing outlet that covered the release of the Durham Report?
I wrote an article on this, and it was everyone was a poo-pooing of the report, which is shocking because I went back and I looked through their coverage from the very beginning of the Steele dossier, and they were calling Trump a cult leader, a mafia boss. Yes. Saying that the people have drank the orange Kool-Aid, and about how bad his Russian connections were. But let's get deal with. Was the point of the Durham Report to get criminal convictions, in your opinion, Scott?
No, it doesn't seem like it was written that way. It seemed like it was written to expose the corruption of the FBI. All these decisions were made by people whose motives were corrupt. We talked about how it was alluded that, that somehow they shouldn't have pounced on this threat of a whisper of a rumor in order to trigger this massive investigation. But that kind of analysis gives them the credit of being honest dealers. They weren't honest dealers. They were corrupt from the inception. So they were going to do it because they had corrupt motives, which were they didn't want Donald Trump to be president of the United States. They wanted Hillary Clinton to be president because of their own power schemes. So, at the end of the day, I say this often at various outlets on LibertyNation.com where I'm talking about the decision to prosecute or the decision to investigate. There's this burlesque, I think, that the top officials kind of perform and that media agrees with, the idea that these are not all political decisions. Who to prosecute for what, when, and how are political decisions. We've got a train wreck of a thing happening right now with this Alvin Bragg prosecution of Donald Trump for a crime that nobody's ever been prosecuted for in the history of ever. And we all know that it's because he wants to get Donald Trump for political reasons, and it's not about a real crime, has nothing to do with protecting the citizens of New York or justice or anything like that. It's just about getting Trump. And it's happening right now in America, in our biggest supposed to be the best city.
Singling people out as targets or to set an example is not in the American system of justice. At least it never has been until Donald Trump came along. Sure, there's other people that have been targeted, but this is an incredibly high bar that they have set, and they do it shamelessly. In other words, essentially, they deny, the media will deny their bias, then they will admit it, then they will wear it as a sleeve, on their sleeve as a badge of honor, and then they will use it as a weapon against the other side. I mean, we're seeing this vicious cycle, and again, as long as the FBI, again, the problem with this Durham report is that all the so-called reforms at the FBI have already been done before this report was issued. So what are we supposed to say? Well, there was a problem then, but, well, they changed management, so everything's going to be okay. I wonder what percentage of the American people think that that is acceptable anymore, to just say, well, that was the Comey FBI. It was a train wreck. But, at least Christopher Wray has straightened out the ship at the FBI. It goes a lot deeper, and it's a lot more rotten than any single administration at the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
I should point out it was also the McCabe FBI, who is now on CNN as a paid contributor, poo-pooing the whole Durham report. Which,
well, it's because he's got an incredible degree of credibility, Mark.
Now, let's do a little checklist here, a legal checklist if we can. So the Clinton campaign funded, at least in part, the Steele dossier, which was the impetus for the entire investigation. Now, CIA John Brenner, he knew because he briefed the White House, and then the FBI took surely there was some cooperation there, but it basically marred Trump's entire time in office. It's dominated his reputation for the last 6 or 7 years. Now, morally wrong, sure. Is it a crime to produce a dossier on your political opponent, give it to the federal agencies, and then have them investigate and essentially make Donald Trump look like a traitor to his country for 6 or 7 years?
So I'm assuming this is I'm fielding this question. And
you are, Scott.
I'll
you
just
are.
go ahead. If you think about what has been done to some of the January 6th defendants, okay? I'm not talking about the ones that were in a tussle with security guards or anything like that. I'm just talking about people who entered the Capitol building at a time and place that they weren't supposed to enter the Capitol building, and what's been done to them in our criminal justice system. And I can tell you that a mildly creative assistant U.S. attorney could come up with a laundry list of crimes against these people, including and especially conspiracy to deny us our civil rights by perverting the election. I mean, you can make up any number of cases for any number of federal crimes that these people have committed. But again, the decision to prosecute is a political one, and they're not going to be prosecuted. And I don't even think they're going to be prosecuted by a Republican administration's attorney general, because there's not the political will to go that deep. I spoke with somebody just the other day who I was talking about the next presidential election with, and this person said, I'm going to vote for Trump because he's the only one who's actually could potentially go in there and really clean house the way that this person thought that it should be done, because he's not married to any, establishment sort of conventions. And I think that just, we can't expect that that's going to happen because it's all baked in, unfortunately. And let me just say this, because I didn't have a chance to say it earlier, or didn't think to say it earlier, which is that I have the cure for all this. And the cure is a massive reduction in the size and scope of the federal government. The reason why these people are fighting so hard to control it is because of the billions and trillions of dollars in spending and influence over every facet of our life. If the federal government was whittled down to its constitutional authority and only controlled what it was supposed to, we wouldn't have half of this trouble, and even less than that.
The answer to almost every problem is less government, as far as I'm concerned there, Scott. Now, Graham, let's wrap this up with you. Give me your final take on this.
The FBI has a department called the Office of Professional Responsibility, and so does the DOJ. And these were the people who were really at fault, because the Office of Professional Responsibility should have looked at this entire Steele dossier thing at the very beginning and said, you do not have enough here to go on. An agency did not follow its own guidelines and did not act in a responsible manner and say at the very beginning, we can't investigate this because we have absolutely no evidence that anything wrong was done. And that's the problem right there.
A failure on multiple levels with two key victims, President Donald Trump and the American people. Gentlemen, thanks ever so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all about we have time for on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to offer my thanks to our superb Durham Report panelists, longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner, Graham J. Noble, and Scott D. Cosenza. And as always, extend my thanks and appreciation to you, the listeners, for joining us here each week. My final thoughts for this week. The Durham investigation and ultimate report were never meant to be about sending Hillary Clinton to the slammer. It was not meant to be a vindication of Donald Trump, although in many respects it was. What the purpose really was to discover if the FBI went beyond the scope of its remit in pursuing a person against whom the agency appeared biased. Now, in that regards, despite what the media might say to poo-poo the report or what the White House refuses to answer even basic questions about, in that regards, it was a resounding success. The American people now have 300 pages of proof that serious mistakes were made that resulted in a multi-year hate campaign against the man responsible for running the country. It's the old refrain, mistakes were made. Well, perhaps this time, the people will not forget that mistakes were made, nor who made them. And perhaps next time, the nation won't be the subject of international ridicule thanks to an overzealous agency that sought to put partisanship above truth. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone, hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner, joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing leftist narratives, debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.